Hi everyone, this is Rosie and this is Nonna Stitching Lounge. I come to you from Stoney Creek, Ontario, just out of Toronto. This broadcast or podcast is about stitching yarn and knitting and crocheting. And today's episode, I'm going to be talking about the differences between crochet and knit and when I choose to do one or the other, and might give you some insight into whether you want to crochet or you want to knit. And if you do both, maybe when you want to do either one of them. So I have my top reasons or my top differences between crocheting and knitting. So let's start. The first one is, so how do you decide whether you want to knit or crochet? So for me, it depends on the project, obviously, but it also depends on the type of yarn. So if I'm dealing with finer yarn or thick yarn like Bernat blanket, I prefer to knit. Okay, so the thick yarn, this Bernat blanket, this is a knit blanket. I prefer to do this because crocheting it, the stitches are so thick, even with a size 10 crochet hook, they're very thick and the blanket is just so heavy and you use so much yarn. So by knitting it, I just find it's lighter, but it's still pretty consistent, and I just prefer it. Also, fine yarn, I prefer to knit because it just has a nicer fabric. So for fine yarn, and I'm talking about anything like finger weighting or even DK for that matter, if you're going to crochet it, you have to crochet with a very fine needle, or sorry, a very small crochet hook. And I don't know, it takes forever. The fabric just doesn't come out the way you want it. It's still too holey. And so I like to crochet with, anything DK, worsted, Aran, anything around like that. Maybe even a number 5, a chunky, but not this Bernat. Forget that. So the second difference between, obviously, as I just alluded to, is it makes different fabrics. So knitting is a very consistent type of fabric. You can do a fine lacy fabric as well. Crocheting, it's just, I find, easier to make a lacy fabric. Now the reason for that is my number 3 is that crocheting is much more forgiving. It's more forgiving because it's less linear. So when you're knitting, it is very linear. You have all these stitches on a needle, right? You make a mistake, you lose a stitch or you pick one up, you're going to see it immediately. Whereas with crocheting, you can fudge it a little bit easier. So you can create a stitch, you can, stitch two together, that sort of thing. And don't tell me you haven't done it, because I know you've done it. So it is more forgiving, and it's just easier to do these kind of lacy stitches. Number 3 is because it's linear, this is very precise. So you have to know all the yarn overs, you have to pick them all up at the right time. If you're off one, the whole thing shifts. It's really bad. With crocheting, like I said, you can come to a spot and you go, oh, I'll just create a stitch, and it's not as noticeable. So when it comes to those kind of fabrics, the lacier fabrics, or the more, how should I say, less kind of standard fabric, I like to crochet. The other thing is that crochet is easier to make a variety of things. So I've been a knitter probably before I was a crocheter, around the same time, but then I did knitting for a long time. I did mostly blankets. I did some like sweaters for the kids when they were younger. And then about 5-6 years ago, I started watching Mikey from the Crochet Crowd and Crystal from Bag a Day. And I just loved the different things they were doing and the different textures they were making with crochet. And it just seemed so much easier than trying to do this with knitting. So I started crocheting, and I've done amigurumi, I've done like squares and then joined squares. It's easier to kind of join things and do different patterns or different shapes and then put them together. Crocheting has a lot of variety that way. Not saying that you can't do knitting, because I've seen like Stephen West does some amazing stuff with knitting, but it really is much more difficult. Like brioche knitting, for instance, I have not tried it. I think, I don't know, it seems very precise, whereas I think I got a similar look with this, crocheting on the front post and the back post, right? Yeah, it's not the same. I know it's not the same, but this is crochet. And I've, I just find it easier to do different types of stitches with crochet. The next difference I find is that I was already said that knitting's very much more precise and much more linear. So crocheting gives you the ability to, for instance, measure as you go. So this is a top-down crochet sweater. And so I measured, I was able to get the chain all the way around my neck. I knew exactly where I wanted it. And then I was able to increase here and increase at the back. And I was able to measure as I go right down to the underarms. And the reason is because you only have one loop on a crochet hook. So you can actually just, put a stitch on that loop so it doesn't fall off and then measure as you go. Whereas when you're knitting, it's much more difficult because you have all these stitches on a cable. And the cable, unless you have a couple of cables attached to each other, isn't usually long enough to kind of put it over your head without losing stitches. Believe me, I know because I've tried it. And so a lot of times, and it's happened to me many times, I get to the underarms, I go to log off, oh my God, I go to cast or to take off the sleeves and put them on a holder, and I'm like, oh my God, this thing is huge. So that's the other difference. With knitting, because it's so precise and you have to really stick to the counts, you have to do a gauge or a swatch to figure out your gauge. I don't gauge. I hate gauging, and so to me that is a pain. So I would rather just trial and error, and then it doesn't fit. It'll be too big, and then I end up frogging the whole thing. Which is another problem, because frogging knitting is very difficult. So especially if your stitches are very slippery. Now, if you're using a heavier wool, like even like the scarfy sweaters that I made recently, you can actually frog it and the stitches stay. You don't tend to lose them. But something like this, very slippery, you're going to lose the stitches. So some people use lifelines, where they actually put a string or something to mark off where they've done okay, and then if they had to frog, they could frog right up to the lifeline and then just pick up all the stitches. Whereas with crochet, you just frog it back, right? You rip it and it's one stitch, and you can go all the way back to your mistake and then start all over again. It's just easier to recover with crocheting than it is for knitting. And so I don't gauge. I don't do a swatch for crocheting. I actually don't do a swatch for knitting either, but I should. So that's a huge difference. So you're able to make fancier techniques with crocheting than you are with knitting quicker. So it's easier to learn some of the fancier techniques with crocheting. So for instance, over in this crocheted sweater I made, you can see it's all very lacy, very different type of fabric, obviously. But you're able to square things off, turn a corner here, like over here. You just see it, and you're able to pick up along the front. It's just easier, and so it really is. You're able to turn corners, increases, that sort of thing. Make make round patterns, squares, and all that sort of thing. So it just has a lot more variety. Amigurumi, I think I mentioned already. Knitting tends, so the other thing is that knitting tends to take longer to make a sweater. One of the reasons I think is because crocheting, you can make a lot of holes and that sort of things, and it goes very fast. But crocheting also has a wider stitch. Knitting, no matter what kind of, like this kind of fabric, you can see the stitches really not that big. Even if you were to use really thick yarn or thick wool or needles, you still have this kind of fabric, right? It's the stitches still aren't as wide as they would be in crocheting. Unless, of course, you're doing a single crochet, which is a little bit different, but even that takes a lot of more yarn, which is the next point, is that crocheting takes up to 30% more yarn. So if you have a project in mind, or you have a yarn in mind, but you only have, let's say, 4 skeins or so many yards, and you want to do a blanket or you want to do something with it, remember that if you go to crochet it, you may need more than if you just went and knit it. So that's the other issue with that. I think I already talked about the different fabrics that it makes. So for garments, I prefer the knit garments because, especially with the DK, right? Because it just has a more, shall I say, in-store bought type of look versus, something that is very unique, right? So this is a little more unique, but it could be store-bought. It's just a ribbing, but you can kind of maybe tell when something is more handmade and crocheted than it is knit. So it's a little bit more refined, shall I say, a little bit more snobbier. Just saying. I do both, so I'm a snob when it comes to knitting too. But it can be more difficult. And I know that knitters in general most of the knitters I know anyway, use very expensive yarn. So they tend to use more of, the merinos, the wools, the cashmeres, the silks, that sort of thing. And I think it's because knitting does take longer. And so if you're going to invest that much time in a project, you may, you want to invest in a more expensive garment, I guess that. Whereas with crocheting, you can do so many things very quickly. It makes sense, maybe, to throw things in the wash and like scarves and cowls and those kind of things. You might want to just use the more reasonably priced yarn. So what else do I have here? So bottom line is that I like to do both, right? I love to crochet probably a little bit more than knit. And again, because of the variety. I do both because I like to give my wrists and hands a break from one or the other. So I find knitting's more finer movements, but I don't know why, but it tends to hurt up and through here. Whereas crocheting, I tend to get it in here. So again, you got to take your breaks with both. But if you do one project, you could alternate. So that's why I like to do both. But it also depends. What I like to do is, because of the type of yarn I'm using, I like to choose a project based on that. If you're new to the fiber arts and you don't know what you want to do, I would knit a scarf and I would crochet a scarf and see which techniques you like the best. It's kind of interesting to see, because, I said like one of the cons of knitting is that it is linear, right? You got to go back and forth, back and forth. But that's also a plus because when you're knitting, right, you have all these stitches, you cast on 20 stitches, for instance, right? You have them all on your needle. At the end of the yarn, at the end of the row, you got to have 20, unless you dropped one somewhere, and it's going to be very obvious that you dropped it, right? So that's good because it makes you really become more of a perfectionist and more precise in what you're doing. Whereas when you're crocheting and you cast and you, let's say, hook, you chain, let's say 20 stitches, it's harder to see where those 20 stitches are until you're more in tune with the way a crochet stitch looks. So it is harder to do as a beginner. So until you get a little bit more practice and you know exactly where the V is and that you have to go in, you have to almost count every single line to make sure you have 20 and that it's you know, going up straight, right? Because that is the biggest problem with crocheting as a beginner, is that you tend to forget the last stitch or the first stitch because you can't see them as easily as when you're carrying 20 stitches on a needle. So there's pros and cons to doing both. Again, both of them you need practice, right? Both of them, there's lots of patterns for both things. Again, you can, with crocheting, it's faster. You can make more variety of things like face cloths and round things and square things and amigurumi. Whereas knitting, a little bit more difficult to get a fancier stitch. But, you know, it's what your preference ends up being, right? So my preference starts with what yarn I'm using and what do I feel like doing at that time. I would think, someone said it very well, I have a friend who's an expert knitter. I mean, she's done I can't remember what it's called, where, you know, she knits in the round and then she actually cuts it. Yeah, I know. And she's done color work like you wouldn't believe. So she is like an expert knitter. So I said to her, I'm a beginner knitter next to you. And she was very kind. She said, no, you're an expert crocheter, but you're a good knitter. So that's good. But I guess it's what you get used to, right? Like, I think with crocheting, I'm at a point where I can design things and I know how to increase and I can fudge it, meaning I can make it longer, shorter, wider. Like, I know how to alternate or change a pattern, whereas knitting, I'm not so confident. I did do my whatever sweater, which actually was pretty easy, and this was actually really fun because it had the stitches weren't exact. It was just about measuring, you know, increasing from top down and then measuring, which is good because that's how I like to work. And so because of the way I prefer to do my crafts, crocheting is actually probably, I'm more in tune with crocheting than knitting. But I like to challenge myself, and so I'm getting a little bit better in knitting, and so it's just deciding which one you like to do better and which yarn you want to use, what kind of you know, fabric you want to make, that sort of thing. So I hope this was useful to you. I hope that it would help you decide whether you want to knit or crochet. Definitely reasons to start both and see how you like it. So thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoyed this. If it's something that you like to hear about, please subscribe to my channel. I have all kinds of different content, and press like if you liked it, and hope to see you soon. Ciao for now.